Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick, back by Kickstarter.
I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight, we'll be covering Blood Red Sky, a new movie on Netflix, combining the popular genres of terrorist airplane takeover and vampire, and Masters of the Universe Revelation, another thing on Netflix, in this case bringing back the popular 80s kids cartoon spearheaded by Kevin Smith. But before all of that Netflix, Alistair, what else have you done, consumed, eaten in the last fortnight?
Well, I've gone back to an obscure film that began a very auspicious career. So I've watched a British thriller called Following, which has the sort of notable accolade of being Christopher Nolan's first ever film. Yeah, and it's really interesting movie. For any fans of Christopher Nolan, obviously got on to great things. It's worth really looking into because it's got a lot of his signatures, and you can see kind of how they developed. It plays around with time, which is probably Christopher Nolan's most notable plot device that he uses. It's a quite interesting, low-budget thriller, quite tense, got some good twists in it. And yeah, you can kind of see where the man went from there. So I'd certainly recommend it to any fans of his Batman movies or Inception, Tenet and the rest.
Sounds interesting. It's always kind of fun to see the very early work by people. Was this pre-Memento? Was Memento his second film?
Yeah, Memento is his second film. And I guess it shows the promise people saw in this first film, that they kind of took this low-budget black and white thriller. It's quite short. It's only really 70 minutes, starring no one famous, and then made a film with Guy Pearce and Carrie-Anne Moss, who were pretty big stars at the time. Carrie-Anne Moss had just been in The Matrix, if I got my timelines right. So yeah, then obviously Memento's huge cult hit, and went up and up from there. It is really worth digging out the kind of the early ones. Quite obscure. It's I don't think it's on any streaming platforms. I sort of had to get DVD from Amazon, but it's just really interesting to see how from even the earliest film the stylistic tricks were there. There's also one, I guess, like sign of things to come, which is the main character, his apartment has the Batman logo on the door.
That's comforting, I guess. I mean, some people are a bit sort of, does Christopher Nolan actually care about Batman? I guess he must care at least a little.
Yeah, I mean, that's a weird sign that it's... Because, a lot of it's about this sort of man who he's a sort of a writer down on his luck. He starts following people just to kind of observe their life, and he ends up caught up with a man who he's a burglar, and he sort of breaks into apartments, but not so much to steal or to make money, but more just to, again, nosy around in these people's lives. Yeah, so a lot of it takes place in kind of, I guess, anonymous apartments. He just used the homes of, I guess, the people he had, as a lot of low-budget indie filmmakers do, use what's available. So I guess to make the main character's apartment seem somewhat different, it's got the Batman symbol on the door, which is... of all the things to choose, could have been the Superman symbol, could have been, I don't know, the logo of the Empire and Star Wars. But yeah, it was kind of really like, wow, that is weird, considering that man went on to do 3 Batman films.
Back in the old days where having the Batman symbol up on your walls made you a unique, interesting outsider rather than just a regular person. Yeah,
because I guess this was, 90s, so... I suppose there were like Batman films in the 90s, but I guess that kind of dark thriller, because he did quite a lot of sort of dark psychological thrillers like Following, Memento, Insomnia before he did Batman. And I suppose because Batman had got so just totally cartoony, over the top, silly with the Joel Schumacher films, that more of a sort of psychological thriller element is exactly what they felt Christopher Nolan needed to bring to Batman to make him relevant again. It's an obvious thing in cinema to like give your main character or something distinctive or whatever to make them stand out. I mean, like, an obvious example is in The Force Awakens. Very early on, Finn's stormtrooper, even before he removes his helmet, he gets covered in blood, so you can instantly recognise him from a group. So yeah, having some little thing that makes you stand out and really works. And again, in this film, mainly involving people in suits talking in rooms, the main character wears a leather jacket and has sort of stubble and slightly long hair, which, makes him distinctive. But they could have chosen anything to make the door distinctive. But it's just, I guess, I mean, I don't think there's any deeper meaning to it than, I guess, it proves that Christopher Nolan was a Batman fan, that was the symbol he reached for.
And anyway, moving, I guess, beyond the Batman symbol, because I sense it's not as important in the film as it is the amount of time we're currently talking about it.
I guess everything ultimately links back to Batman.
Well, yeah. Good. But the rest of the film's good as well as this Batman symbol.
No, it's really, really tense. Again, it really shows how talented he is as a director, because I've worked with like indie low budget filmmakers, and obviously it's hard to make like a film that's basically, unless you've got like something super cool, to hand. Like, you have a friend who owns an abandoned nuclear reactor or whatever, which seems unlikely. A lot of indie films do break down to they're going to be people talking in rooms, probably the houses of our friends. So building an interesting plot, a tense plot around that's going to look good on the DVD shelf next to films with a much bigger budget is a real challenge. And again, this quite simple premise of like people breaking into other people's apartments, kind of nosing around. The plot that evolves out of it is a quite tense psychological thriller plot, and it's really quite riveting. Over time, you really get hooked, and you kind of want to see where it's going. So Christopher Nolan aside, it's just like a good thriller.
So it has actually held up well then. You would recommend going back and finding this?
Yeah, no, I would. There are a lot of like low budget thrillers out there. Next to something like Shallow Grave, it's maybe not as good, but its main, I guess, article significance is that it's the beginning of this kind of very illustrious career. But as a film in its own right, it totally stands up. And if you're a fan of Christopher Nolan, his Batman work or his other work, it is really interesting to see like the stylistic ticks of like playing with time and twists and things like that. Like were there right from the beginning. Anyway, that's what I've been doing with my spare time in the last 2 weeks. Nick, what have you been up to?
I've been watching the first couple of series of the BBC sitcom Ghosts. This is a show that I think has taken off a bit in the last few years. It's probably one of the big sitcom successes of recent days. Certainly, it's appearing in a massive honking banner across the iPlayer homepage, which suggests that it's doing pretty well. And yeah, this is a series about a young couple who, whilst desperately looking for a house in the modern housing market, some very relatable house hunting scenes at the beginning, find themselves suddenly discovering that they've inherited through an obscure relative a massive old mansion, and they move into this mansion with the hope of renovating it and using it as a hotel, but then they discover it's haunted by a load of ghosts, like loads and loads of them. Yeah, basically the rest of the series is a sort of massive ensemble comedy of this couple trying to get this house shipshape, a sort of ongoing DIY experience while these ghosts harass and annoy them. The couple are played by Charlotte Ritchie, who long-time British show lovers may remember from Fresh Meat as Oregon, the pretentious middle-class one, and her husband is played by Keel Smith-Bino, who I haven't seen before but is very good. And I think a lot of the ghosts are played by cast members from the Horrible Histories show, which I have not actually seen because I think I'm just slightly too old to watch it when it was coming out for the kids. But I hear it was incredibly good. So this is apparently their take at a slightly more moving towards adult sitcom. And yeah, it's good. The sheer volume of people they're able to work with is honestly one of the most impressive parts. I mean, literally counting them, there's 11 regular characters, which is, that's a lot. That's more than The West Wing. That's more than a lot of shows. And it's only a half-hour sitcom, but they all usually get a moment. Maybe not always an incredibly developed, nuanced storyline, but there's always a moment, and there's a good sense of sort of building chaos in every episode, which is kind of what you want from a comedy, really. There's lots of stuff happening, and then often seeming entirely unrelated, and it's always funny, and in the last few minutes it usually builds to some sort of ridiculous climax. This is on its third series now. I think the third series actually dropped a couple of weeks ago. I'm not quite that current, but I have just started watching series 2, so I'll be caught up soon enough.
That sounds good. Yeah, I do like something that kind of plays around with genre, I guess, combining some kind of low-level horror with sort of the sitcom format. I mean, the most obvious comparison that comes to mind is What We Do in the Shadows. Is that a fair comparison?
I think so, yeah. It's maybe a bit more knowingly silly and tee-hee-hee and panto than What We Do in the Shadows. In a sort of British way, I think. Although, to be fair, having thought about it for 10 seconds, What We Do in the Shadows is also pretty panto and silly at times. But yeah, it maybe takes itself a tiny bit less seriously. But yeah, there is a lot in common about that, I think. The sort of idea of these supernatural creatures in this domestic setting being often quite petty and often quite silly and annoying rather than horrifying.
Yeah.
It definitely has that in common. And there's also quite a lot of enjoyable, gentle culture clash comedy, because the idea is the ghosts, the 9 ghosts in the show, are like this massive range of everyone who's died on this site over the years. They range from a caveman who was clearly living on the land the house now occupies, to a Georgian noblewoman, a romantic poet, and a disgraced Tory MP who died in a sex scandal in 1993.
That's a reference to a specific person.
It's I'm actually not politically aware enough to know who you mean, but yeah, it's a very good range of people, and yeah, a lot of the jokes, to be honest, are basically them, the ghosts, arguing with each other or having misunderstandings with each other or with the main couple about just what the hell's going on.
Sounds very funny, and I guess there's similarity to Horrible History in that you're kind of bringing in elements from across history, different historical periods, which I can kind of see would really appeal to them, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. There's a few sort of flashbacks to the period, but it's just these load of people, all in their sort of respective period dress, hanging around in this house, yelling at this beleaguered couple, who just look perpetually tired and worn down.
Looking at the cast, I can see one of the ghosts Simon Farnaby?
Yes, Tyrone Farnaby is in fact the trouserless Tory MP.
Oh, that's perfect casting. Yeah, obviously I really enjoyed his work in Detectorists, which is another sort of great sort of sitcom. And obviously, recently he's been in the new Alan Partridge TV show. Some good casting there. None of the other names look familiar, but some of them just look like I'm sure I've seen Jim Howick. I'm sure I've seen in something.
Lolly Adafope, I think I've heard of on sort of stand-up podcasts. But yeah, there's not really a weak link in it. It's a good show. It does an impressive job of very occasionally giving each character a sort of semi-serious storyline, but usually in a very sort of knowingly silly way. The things they have to come to terms with in their semi-serious moments are often quite silly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's like great sitcom writing, that you can find the humour in emotional moments and find the emotion in silliness.
As I say, it seems to have been one of the big comedy hits for the BBC in the last few years. I believe they're making an American version, one of the leads being played by the main actress from iZombie, Rose McIver, who's going to make a living now playing the person who can talk to the supernatural.
Yeah, well, she's good also playing, I guess, a normal person thrust into like absurd or supernatural circumstance. But that does disappoint me, the fact that like everything must be remade in American. But I guess you could argue it's a sign of respect.
Something like that. I don't know. I think there is a slightly sort of British, knowingly panto sensibility. I don't know. Part of me can't be bothered to watch the same thing twice, but part of me would be interested to see if there's a slightly more, I don't know, serious upmarket attempt to make the history stuff seem a bit less camp and panto-y when they do it for America. I might watch a couple of episodes if I find myself overburdened with free time.
I guess it'll be substantially different because it'll be American history, so there'll be a different cast of characters.
It's true. That'll also be interesting to see how they do it. I haven't actually checked exactly how they're casting the ghosts, but presumably it'll be a bit different.
Yeah.
I did also watch We Are Lady Parts, by the way, as recommended by Alistair. So yeah, if you want some British comedy from the last few years, both Ghosts and We Are Lady Parts, very much worth watching.
Yeah, I can strongly recommend We Are Lady Parts. Ghosts has been on the list, actually. Yeah, I should watch it, yes. You're not the only person I think to recommended it, but you're giving it a glowing recommendation, so I want to look it up.
Yeah, it's really good. Check it out.
Next up, we'll be discussing Blood Red Sky, a new horror thriller on Netflix. Nadia is flying from Germany to the US with her son Elias to be treated for a mysterious condition. When the plane she is on is overtaken by terrorists, Nadia is shot. It is then revealed that Nadia is a vampire possessed of supernatural strength, speed, and the desire to drink blood, and a powerful desire to protect her son. We saw this film recently. Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I enjoyed this. Basically, it's a fairly straight genre mix. On the one hand, you've got the templates of a sort of thriller where the terrorists take over a plane, but little do they know, there's also a lone badass on board on his way to his holiday or to visit his parents or something. But yeah, instead of the lone badass being a cop or a secret agent or a massively muscled SAS guy, it's a random vampire on her way to seek treatment for her condition. And it more or less works in the end. I watched it in two halves, as I often do with these films, because Twitter has demolished my attention span. And it was interesting actually watching it like that, how sharp the distinction was. Like, the first half felt like a quite dry setup for the thriller premise, like alarmingly straight version of sort of terrorists take over a plane, apart from maybe a couple of flashbacks to how she became a vampire. It was fine, I guess. It was a competent example of what it was, but it wasn't blowing me away. And then the second half starts, as luck would have it. In terms of time, the second half starts about the time that she pulls her wig off and goes like full Nosferatu. The blood starts flowing and it's good. Yeah, the second half was great. Honestly, my main opinion of this film is that they could probably have chopped the first hour in half by trimming a lot of flashbacks and flash forwards, generally making it a bit leaner, and then got quicker to the second half where it really took off. Plain joke. So yeah, pretty decent. Could have been better, but pretty decent.
Yeah, it's interesting because this film is pretty much exactly 2 hours and 1 minute, so it does neatly cleave into like 2 hour long sections.
Correct. Yes, it does.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That basically the second half, it almost like suddenly kicks up a gear. Yeah, the actual defining point is when she loses her wig. Not really explained why that she's a bold vampire. I don't know. She has to take injections for not being a vampire. I don't know if they're linking that to chemotherapy. But anyway, she wears a wig. When the wig comes off, the premise that she's a normal human being, or the premise that she's pretending to be a normal human being, goes out the window, and we just get tension and ultra-violence from that point onwards. And yeah, that is really good. It is very tense. And yeah, I would recommend the movie for when it gets to that point. And there's a lot of violence. It's quite scary. And yeah, there's like a high degree of tension. It's just really like a really like entertaining kind of genre piece at that point.
Yeah, there's some good sort of thriller plotting as well. Like a lot of elements are put into play throughout the film, including in the first half, and they all sort of stack on each other, and they are paid off impressively, like ticking boxes in the second half. Like the way things affect other things and happen at certain times to steadily make things worse and worse and worse and worse is quite well regulated. As I say, the second half is a very strong strong, fast-release thriller moments, combined with the sort of horror trope of this vampire stalking the plane and blood running in the aisles. Yeah, once it gets going, it's incredibly good. Although, yes, the first half can be a bit of a slog. The first half... It possibly doesn't help, but a lot of the aesthetic, somewhat forced by the setting, I guess, but they could have still made, I don't know, more effort to make it more exciting. It's quite grey and flat and bland. There's lots of people running up and down this plane, or just plodding up and down this plane. And it just doesn't help with this feeling of not much momentum at times. There's just a lot of airport, a lot of plane, a lot of sitting, a lot of talking. I know they've got things to set up, but I feel like they could have maybe blitzed through it a bit faster.
Yeah, I can see how you could get it down to maybe a tighter, like, hour and a half film. But it really does work well with the kind of the plane setting. Yeah, again, like, I've seen this film compared to, it's like Die Hard, but with vampires. You know, it's part of this, like, history of tense, claustrophobic plane films, because, like, speaking to people who have claustrophobia, they say, like, flying is, like, the worst thing. And it's not necessarily because of the size of the planes are small. Obviously, planes are much smaller than, like, large buildings, but, like, what makes planes frightening for people with claustrophobia is that there's no way out. Like, you cannot get off, and obviously that's really what filmmakers play with in plane-based thrillers, the concept there is nowhere to run, there is nowhere you can escape to. It's like the most self-contained setting you can have unless you're going to set your thriller in space. That really, like, adds to the tension, and again, also the kind of, like, the horror element is being stuck in a small space with, like, a horror creature or a dangerous predator. That also adds to the tension. I mean, one of the interesting things is that they've kind of inverted the horror aspect, in which case is that the horror's on the protagonist side, on the good guy side. You know, you kind of want there to be horror and carnage because that's a sign that things are going well for the protagonist or the good guys. And it is unusual to have, like, genre film about a vampire where the vampire is the hero, especially a film when you've taken, like, a horror element and put it in regular life, as opposed to kind of, there's plenty of, like, horror movies set more in fantasy worlds, you know, like, so your Twilights, your Underworlds, you know, things like that have vampires or supernatural characters as kind of protagonists in a wider story of a wide range of supernatural characters. Whereas it's unusual to have, if you've got a supernatural character in a sort of more mundane setting, that's usually a more traditional horror setup with them as the villain. But this kind of inverts that by saying, yes, there are people who are worse than vampires. Terrorists.
Yeah, and the terrorists are not, you know, the most complicated, nuanced, developed villains in the world. One of them, randomly, is played by Dominic Purcell, who I know primarily as the sort of gruff, lovable thief with a heart of gold character on Legends of Tomorrow. He's definitely not got a heart of gold here. He's just playing a bad terrorist.
Yeah, and I know him as, he was Lincoln Burrows in Prison Break, the guy that they were, the whole point was to break him out of prison. Yeah, that was an interesting casting decision.
A surprisingly small role in some ways. Like, he's not even the main terrorist, really.
He's just because he's a famous face.
I don't know, is this part of the phenomenon of getting famous-ish faces in deceptively small roles, so they don't actually have to do that much work? Like, Graham McTavish turns up as well, playing a random army general in, I guess I shouldn't spoil the ending, but in what is not a huge role.
Yeah. Again, it depends on how much of the plot we want to spoil, but they do play around with some of the conventions of the kind of a terrorist or hostage thriller. So, yeah, if I can't complete this point without dropping, like, a few spoilers. It's not like spoilers for right at the ending, but it's kind of spoilers for the middle part. So, spoiler warning at this point. Flee if your lives intact. And the point I'm trying to make is that usually there's, like, within the villains, there's there's a hierarchy. For example, in Die Hard, they usually get dispatched working up the hierarchy. Like, Alan Rickman is the last one to die or the second last one to die, actually, in Die Hard. They work their way up to the big baddie at the end, whereas Dominic Purcell, aka Lincoln Burrows or whatever, he's like kind of the leader of the terrorist gang. He gets dispatched quite early on, and he's not the one who hangs around to the end, and that subverts the usual kind of terrorist thriller plotline, which is the big baddie goes last, and also gives you the sense of they can be dispatched in any order.
Well, it's sort of psychological order, isn't it? Because we both know who the most dangerous evil terrorist is. It's the other guy who's doing a bit of a auditioning to be the Joker performance, to be honest, a sort of evil sadist.
Yeah.
It actually comes across as quite odd in the first hour of the movie, that performance, when everyone else is quite low-key and he's like full-on rubbing people's faces and going, ooh, what'll happen if I touch you with this knife?
Smearing himself in blood.
But yeah, as a result of him, hamming it up in Joker mode, it has become fairly obvious that he is the evilest of the terrorists, and therefore he's kind of the big boss, even if he's not the high-ranking one.
Yeah, that is a good point, yeah. Although, that character is, sort of entertainingly unpleasant and, clearly like the nastiest one and is quite creepy, there is an element of that, which is, again, a horror trope that they kind of or sort of like thriller trope, which they do kind of do in a fairly straight up way, which is that character is sort of queer coded. There's a bit quite early on that's implied that he's gay, or at least pretending to be gay. He's an air steward, which again is also more leading into the tropes of there's something inherently effeminate about like a man being a steward on a plane. And then there's kind of, we go from a sort of queer coded character to he's also a disgusting sadist who has a penchant for violence, and especially violence against children. Which I understand that there's kind of the sadist character, slightly Joker-esque, is, as you put it, is exactly right. Again, like willingness to do violence against children, it amps up the tension, but I don't think it's necessary to kind of imply the character was gay, and it does lead into some unpleasant stereotypes.
Yeah, I did sort of clock that as well, yeah.
But, as a villain, he is quite, sort of disgustingly unpleasant. They do establish early on, again, by smearing the character in blood, so he stands out, that he's the nastiest one, and he's kind of the big bad, even if he's not, like, the big boss, I suppose.
A lot of the characters are relatively thin. The lead actor playing the vampire and the child playing her son are both pretty good. And to be honest, they're one of the only emotional relationships in the movie we're really expected to invest very much in at all. So it's good that it works, basically.
Yeah.
Having said that, she has a vague relationship she develops with another bloke on the plane, and conversely, that relationship feels a bit fast-tracked and maybe doesn't quite get to where the film needs it to go, but whatever, he's not in it that much.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of he's the sort of, external perspective character. He's the protagonist, who's not a vampire or connected to vampires. Yeah, I mean, the character was kind of serviceable for a thriller kind of horror film that is not going to lean heavily on characterization. It was fine. It did what it needed to do. One of the things I did like about the film is they kind of kept it ambiguous what the terrorists' plan was. They were going to take over a plane, but why is kind of, they threw out again several slightly different theories that the passengers are speculating on, and none of it's confirmed, which I did like. They kind of kept that ambiguous, but they kind of at one point, the terrorists, they're, apart from one, they're all white men, but they're kind of pretending that it's a sort of act of Islamic terrorism on the plane. It's kind of their cover. And he's a sort of a man who speaks Arabic, got a Middle Eastern background. So he's weaved into the plot in that sense. But yeah, it's very much like it's a functional sort of thriller plot. This film is not going on characterization. Where it does have moments of characterization, it's saved for the core relationship of the mother and her son. And it's serviceable for a thriller.
Yeah, and as I say, the good bits are in the second half when the horror elements mix in with the thriller, and you get this sort of combination of like tight claustrophobic action on a plane and sudden massive jump scares and bloodbaths. And it does weave those together quite well once it finally gets to them. If the idea of a thriller horror hybrid sounds appealing to you, it's probably worth sitting through the first half of this film to get to the second half.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do like the way they play with genres. Yeah, again, mash things together. Like, I've seen every iteration of like Die Hard or like Air Force One at this point, and unless you're going to do the trope straight up, you need to find like an original take on it. And again, like bringing in horror elements works. Again, inverting it so that like the vampire is the protagonist. It's good when there's carnage because it means things are going well for the protagonist. Is a total inversion, and it is just tense. It is one of those things that, like, I was kind of totally captivated, especially from the moment, like I say, when the wig came off and the blood came out.
Yeah, it came at about the right time. It was about when I was really waiting for things to kick right off. But I was more waiting, sort of on the edge of my seat, hoping. Like, I felt like they could have done a better job of, I don't know, aggressively building tension. But, I don't know, they got there in the end, though.
Finally, this episode, we'll be talking about Masters of the Universe Revelation, a new animation adaptation of He-Man developed by Kevin Smith and created by Powerhouse Animation, which also produced Blood of Zeus and Castlevania, shows we've reviewed on the podcast. This show loosely picks up the plot of the 80s Masters of the Universe animated series, with a new twist that this show focuses on He-Man's friends, mainly Teela, rather than the hero himself. We've seen the first part of what is, I think, a 2-part series consisting of 5 episodes each. Nick, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I thought it was good. I did come away with a slight vague sense of I'm not sure this is aimed at me, in that, I don't know, I guess I was maybe expecting them to be a bit more, this is a revamp, or this is a reimagining, or this is an attempt to re-pitch the characters to an unfamiliar audience. But honestly, I mostly felt like I was starting from the first episode of season 8 or something of a show that was already in progress, which is obviously fine for the existing fans, but I was a bit sort of, alright, sure. you're not going to try too hard to catch my emotions on this. Then you're just going to go straight into it. And yeah, again, I'm sure that's fine for the audience that exists. I was just a bit, I did then, as a result, I came away a bit sort of, is this aimed at me? I don't know. It's Masters of the Universe is not the most complicated concept in the world, so I was able to pick up the bones of it, and it's an interesting way to go with it. Like, there's a twist at the end of episode 1, which we're going to have to spoil in a minute, like literally in a minute or so, to actually talk about this in any detail, but skirting it for the moment. Yeah, it did an interesting job, I think, of finding a new angle on things. There's a lot of fun moments and fun cameos and silly little things I assume are from the lore. There's a character called Merman who is literally just some sort of talking fish who I enjoy quite a lot. It's a solidly done plot, even though I didn't come into it knowing much about the characters. A lot of them are straightforward enough archetypes, but I was able to sort of enjoy their journey within the show. In particular, there's a character called Evil Lynn, literally Evil Lynn, who has a sort of maybe redemption arc during this series, who I assume was a villain in the previous iteration. And yeah, I thought that was interestingly played. It was a weird sense of, well, I'd probably find this really interesting and engaging if I knew anything about this character. But it was alright even without. So yeah, but I thought it was fine. I sense I could have enjoyed it more had I known anything.
Yeah, I think, once again, you've sort of hit the nail on the head with straight out the door with this one, which is, my question I had watching is, like, who is this aimed at? Is it aimed at grown-ups or children? And, I mean, I did feel that, like, if this is a children's show, then it doesn't really have much to offer that I guess the 80s cartoon has. It just feels literally like they've picked it up. In fact, a brief Wikipedia scan, although I'm not sure how accurate this is, was that they did originally pitch this as like a direct sequel, but actually because of copyright issues, they couldn't directly pick up the story, so it's more of a kind of, I don't know, emotional sequel or a follow-on. Obviously, it's billed very much as kind of a continuation. There's the first 30 seconds fills in all the essential kind of backstory and lore that you need, but I don't really understand what's the point in kind of just making more of something from the 80s that's kind of quite old and kind of stale at this point. Maybe it's because I have very little or no nostalgia for He-Man. I might feel differently. It was something that I cared about, but I did feel that this is like, there's no attempt to kind of, or little attempt to kind of reimagine or have like new take on the characters. It's a very straight up, He-Man as the hero in his fantasy land, and, I guess I'm focusing on his various friends. I guess that this is the element I'm struggling with, is that if it is aimed at children and it's basically just a modern Saturday morning cartoon supposed to be exactly aimed at the same audience, then I guess it's fine, and I'm not the target audience. If it's supposed to be aimed at grown-ups, then the dialogue is just dire, characterization is non-existent, and the plot lacks tension.
I don't think this is aimed at grown-ups. I mean, this is basically this is written at the Saturday morning cartoon level. It is that. It is just more Masters of the Universe at that level.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a barometer for what that level is, having not seen any Masters of the Universe. Like, I didn't even know He-Man had a secret identity. There's other bloke who looks like a deflated He-Man.
It's on the list of, like, really, like, rubbish, like, secret identities.
Yeah, I didn't know that was even a thing. So it's all new for me. I really know nothing. But yeah, I assume it's consistent with that.
Yeah, it's sort of, it picks up the look and feel of that. And I suppose, like, if it's aimed at, like, if it's aimed at children, then it works on the level of a Saturday morning cartoon. I did feel like, especially, that the dialogue was particularly flat and lacked sparkle. Very unnatural, very heavy on exposition. Again, if it's aimed at children, maybe that's what children need. But it did boggle my mind that, like, why have they hired Kevin Smith, the man who's known for, like, being funny and witty and doing comedies, and then just made him write this kind of really pedestrian, like, flat dialogue? It seems like a bizarre decision to make.
Kevin Smith seems to have had a nice time doing it, and I'm sure this is a childhood dream for him. And if nothing else, I guess it's a development of his style, and it definitely doesn't seem very Kevin Smith does He-Man. If you maybe watched this and said, now, which cult film director made this project? It would be a while before I got to Kevin Smith.
Yeah.
But it's, again, if it's him channeling his childhood, then fair enough. Right, shall we spoil the end of episode 1?
I think yes. There's really no point talking about this more without doing that.
Right, at the end of episode 1 of this, and again, spoiler warning, this is very much the premise. It's been out for a while, so this is also the source of a lot of the controversy around it, so you may have heard this spoiler, but here it comes. At the end of episode 1 of Masters of the Universe Revelation, He-Man dies heroically, and then the character Teela takes over as main protagonist for the remainder of the series. And yes, as you can imagine, the killing of a big burly man to replace him with a woman as main hero has drawn criticism from the exact people you'd expect it to draw criticism from, and obviously we're not down with that shit. But yeah, it's an angle, it's a way of bringing it back and doing something different, he says, with very little idea what they were doing before. And I think it does give Teela an interesting arc to work through. I think the character stuff in this series that does work is a lot of the stuff that is like, okay, the old way has genuinely changed, we have to move forward now. Things like Teela adjusting to being on her own, and Evil Lynn stupid name, sort of having her redemption arc. And those are the things that are interesting in this, and which will hopefully be advanced further in the second half.
Yeah, I mean, that is the most original thing for it, is actually, they have come up with something different there, which is that, we'll move He-Man to the sidelines. He's a constant presence, even though through his absence. There's lots of memories of him. He appears in every episode through flashbacks.
Which I thought was kind of shit, by the
way. It's like they had to actually get him in there, I guess. I guess they realised we can't literally do a He-Man cartoon without He-Man.
But he's not even called He-Man. It does reek a bit of, Kevin Smith goes into a meeting and says, okay, our big take is we're going to kill He-Man and have Teela be the hero. And his paymasters at Netflix or Mattel Toys or whoever said, okay, but He-Man has to be on screen at least once in every episode, even if he's dead in the current timeline. And then they proceeded to go back and crowbar that shit in.
There's a plausible explanation for what happened. Yeah, so He-Man he's constantly discussed about. He's in it a lot. But yeah, the focus on Teela is somewhat different. They've got Sarah Michelle Gellar to voice her, who's obviously a good, well-known geek culture figure, does a good performance, and there is something of a character arc, especially as she comes to terms with first of all, that her friend's dead, but also that she didn't know Prince Adam's secret identity was He-Man. Almost all of her friends did. I mean, that does seem weird the more you think about it. There's an emotional fallout from that, and that's kind of the emotional arc linked with the plot arc of they must reforge the sword of power and bring He-Man back, or bring magic back to Eternia, I guess, because the magic is gone now that He-Man's been killed. Yeah, and I mean that is probably the most original thing about this show. The plot that follows from it is a fairly generic fantasy plot where they go to a place and talk to usually like a wizard or something and get a magical item. It is at least slightly different focus.
Yeah, I enjoyed some of the random fantasy creatures they encountered. As I say, I found Merman, the melodramatic fish man, weirdly entertaining. And also there's this recurring idiot wearing a Cyclops hat who keeps turning up to bang on about how technology is taking over from magic, which I can only assume is meant to be a metaphor for modern times.
Yeah.
I don't think it's making a developed satirical point, but he is stupid and it is funny.
Yeah.
Whether that is what they were going for, I don't know.
I guess one of the things that to mention is also when He-Man's killed, Skeletor is also killed. So they have not only removed He-Man, but also He-Man's big villain from the plot. So the character Triclops, I believe, is the kind of substitute villain in that the magic is leaking out of Eternia and this weird machine cult thing that's not really explained where it comes from or what it wants to do is spreading across the land, and that's why they have to reforge the Sword of Power. I mean, it's Saturday morning cartoon stuff, really. I mean, it seems unfair to say it made no sense and came out of nowhere, but at the same time, it made no sense and came out of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, we chose to watch this, and I don't know what we were expecting, adult He-Man. Were we expected to go full Castlevania and have them swearing and dishing out piles of blood? Probably not.
No, I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting Kevin Smith to imbue his personality into it in some way, and I was expecting at least something more original with a more, I don't know, self-awareness or more humour, doing something a little different. I mean, again, if they feel it's like we've got to stick very rigidly to the original format, it's aimed at children, we've switched out the main character, that's about as far as we can go, I guess, fair enough. I mean, again, it just loops back to your original point straight out the door, which is that, who's this aimed at? If it's aimed at children, then I suppose it works on that level. Again, like, these are things I found disappointing. And I do think it's odd that they got Kevin Smith, and it seems very un-Kevin Smith. I wasn't expecting, Clerks-style dirty humour about sex acts or things like that. But I was expecting it to be at least vaguely Kevin Smith.
Yeah, no, I basically agree. It was a sort of decently made sequel to the original cartoons, but yeah, it doesn't really transcend it further in any exciting way. So unless you are an existing hardcore Masters of the Universe fan, you could probably skip this, to be honest. I do not know if I see myself watching the second half.
No. The one thing actually to be safe for is, and I won't spoil it, but the last few seconds of the kind of first half plot does actually have, again, there was a surprise at the end, which I guess maybe my expectations have been so low at that point, it did generally catch me by surprise. And there's a surprise and a sort of twist in the plot, which sets up what will be the motion for the second half of this. And I'm not saying I'm going to watch it, unless we need something for the podcast. But I don't know, maybe there'll be something more interesting going on in the second half.
Yeah, I'll give you that. The very end of the run, which I guess we shouldn't spoil, was impressively tense and it was a good cliffhanger. We'll see. We'll see what's going on in my life when the second half drops. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence for this fortnight. Thank you very much for listening, as ever. If you want still more, you can go to our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can find various articles, deleted scenes, and of course all our previous episodes. And if you enjoy what we do, then please feel free to leave us a review on your podcast app of choice. As many stars as possible, please.
You can also find us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, or find us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. If you want anything more from me, I can be found on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball. You can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. You can also find more of my writing at the Moderate Fantasy Violence website. If you head there now, you should see an article I've written about French tech thriller Osmosis and what it has to say about big tech.
And yep, if you want more from me, you can go to nickbryan.com, or you could also, if you want to help my endeavours, back my Kickstarter, which is currently running for FairyFare, my new comic about the fairies using an app to grant wishes, which is illustrated beautifully by Rosie Alexander. Yep, we're doing pretty well as of this recording, but we would love to get as far as possible in this middle of campaign slow patch so we can have a big power to the finish. So if anyone fancies backing, much appreciated. Thank you very much. And you can also follow me on Twitter at NickMB, where I am mostly talking about said Kickstarter. And I will also be talking about the Kickstarter for, I believe, one final time on the next episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, where we will be covering the new Ryan Reynolds movie, Free Guy, and the new Marvel TV animated show thing, What If. Thank you very much. See you then. Bye.
Hey.
Right, bloody ready sky.